Hi there. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Amelia Holmes, and I'm excited to introduce you to our speaker. Paul J. Polgar is an assistant professor of history at the University of Mississippi, where he researches and teaches on slavery, race, and emancipation in the United States and the broader Atlantic world. His first book, Standard Bearers of Equality, America's First Abolition Movement, was published in 2019 by the University of North Carolina Press. Professor Polgar is now at work on two projects, including a co-edited collection of essays that will re-examine the emergence of racial slavery in the Atlantic world, and a sole-authored second book project that will explain anew the emergence in the Reconstruction era of a broad electoral coalition in support of a path-breaking expansion of Black civil and political rights. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. If you have any questions, please submit them for the Q&A after Paul's presentation. Great, over to you, Paul.
Well, thank you so much, Amelia, for inviting me, and thank you to the Nantucket Historical Association for hosting me. Although I live in Oxford, Mississippi now, where my job is, I'm actually, I was born and bred in Boston, so it's nice to be in Massachusetts briefly, if only virtually. I'm going to open up a PowerPoint to add some visuals here. And what I'm going to do is just sort of attempt to give a broad overview of this book project, which, you know, it's hard to boil down to about a 20 to 25 minute presentation. This was the product of some 10 years of research and writing, and over 300-page book, but I'm going to just sort of lay out broadly what my book is attempting to do historically, and sort of an overall summary of its arguments and its sort of larger narrative. So first of all, what is the purpose of my book? What am I trying to accomplish? Well, a few things that I want to lay out. First of all, I'm really trying to showcase the history of abolitionism before 1830, right? So most histories of abolitionism begin in 1830 or maybe 1833 with the founding of the American Anti-Slavery Society. Nantucket itself was very much involved with that abolition movement of immediate abolitionism. You know, Frederick Douglass, think William Lloyd Garrison as these famous historical actors. And if you open a textbook, or if you talk to someone who sort of what were they taught in high school and college, they're probably going to tell you that abolitionism really began, for all intents and purposes, in the 1830s, in the antebellum period. Well, I'm pushing back on that, and I'm sort of telling a longer, broader history. And what I'm trying to do, one of the things I'm trying to do with that is to show that issues of slavery, of race, of African-American rights, these were issues that were hotly debated among Americans, Black and white, all the way from the beginning of the nation's founding. They didn't just start in the period that we call the antebellum era. So that's one thing. Another thing I'm trying to do is to sort of flesh out and recover what I name first movement abolitionism, or the first abolition movement, as a movement in its own right. So historians before me certainly had many very effective arguments for the different historical actors that make up the first abolition movement, actors that I'll talk about soon, but they didn't, or they hadn't chronicle of the anti-slavery and abolitionism before 1830 as a movement in its own right. And so that's a big part of what I'm trying to do, is to show how this movement was a movement, that it was a broad, cohesive vision for ending slavery and, as I'll talk about, making African Americans citizens of the nation. One more thing I want to point out about what I'm trying to do with this book is to show that a lot of the key attributes of the more well-known and documented immediate abolitionists and abolitionism of the 1830s, things like moral suasion, overcoming white prejudice, the cultivation of an anti-slavery public, biracial activism, the importance of Black citizenship and equality before the law. So these are all themes that we associate with antebellum abolitionism or immediate abolitionism, the likes of William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. But I argue that, in fact, those goals, those themes very much informed this earlier abolition movement that I'm chronicling here. And just to sort of capture the kind of heart and the embodiment of the movement, I want to show you two different depictions of our early abolitionism. So one of them, probably many, if not all of you, are familiar with this symbol, this "Am I not a man and a brother," which became an international anti-slavery image and sort of icon from the 1780s all the way through really the 1840s and beyond. This was first created in 1787 in London, and the sister society to one of the main abolition societies that I chronicle, the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, received this emblem, and they decided to, in creating their own seal or their own emblem for their society, revise it. And this is what they did. In the second image you can see, they created their own vision of Black freedom. And it's very different than this first image, which shows this enslaved man on bended knee, almost pleading for freedom, right? Still in chains, as you can see here. This second image you have an African-American man who is sort of literally, as you can see, breaking the chains of slavery, kind of greeting freedom here with this palm outstretched with a sense of confidence, joining hands with a white abolitionist, almost sort of announcing to the United States here, this emblem is a vision of the new nation in which Black people are included as citizens, in which slavery ends and the emancipated become incorporated into the body politic. And so this image really acts to embody the spirit of first movement abolitionism that I chronicle in the book. Now I want to lay out three goals of first movement abolitionism that I chronicle in the book. And I'll say a little bit about each of these goals. So the first goal of first movement abolitionists, and by the way, when I say first movement abolitionists, broadly speaking, I'm talking about a coalition of abolition societies, such as the Pennsylvania Abolition Society and the New York Manumission Society, along with their Black allies within communities of color in cities like New York and Philadelphia. So I'm going to say more about the historical actors that made up this movement, but broadly speaking, that's who I'm referring to when I'm referring to the first abolition movement or first movement abolitionists. So one of the three goals I'm going to mention here for this movement was enforcing and expanding Northern gradual emancipation statutes. So slavery is put on the road, as is often said, to gradual extinction in the Northern states between 1780 and 1804. And the societies that I focus on are especially sort of focusing on enforcing and expanding emancipation statutes in New York and Pennsylvania. And what happens is these abolition societies respond to the calls for aid and help from illegally enslaved individuals, and they team up with these people to enforce and expand laws, because gradual emancipation laws went well beyond just sort of saying slavery is going to end after a certain date. There's also this other assortment of laws that opened avenues to a more immediate Black freedom. And I'm happy to talk about some of those maybe in the Q&A, but just for purposes of time, I won't go into the details with those laws. But what's happening here is, as illegally enslaved people of color and the first movement abolition societies are teaming up, they're really asserting the fundamental rights of people of color as rights-bearing citizens. You know, they're bringing court cases, they're pushing back against illegal enslavement of these people, and they're really working on the ground to make emancipation a reality in the Northern states. So that's one theme, enforcing and expanding Northern gradual emancipation. A second theme is the goal of incorporating Black Americans into the Republic as citizens. And so this goal included a program of free Black educational and socioeconomic aid, with the goal of sort of sculpting virtuous free Black citizens who could prove the capacity of Black Americans for virtuous freedom. Now, this program was a response to the defenders of slavery, who during this gradual emancipation period are arguing that, in fact, formerly enslaved people could never be made virtuous citizens, and that their very freedom would threaten the fabric of the new nation. This idea that someone who was enslaved could never be virtuously free, and if they're freed, they'll threaten the very fabric of society. And so, and by the way, this sort of argument, this defense of slavery, this pro-slavery argument, is trying to sort of draw on the fears of the founding generation that generation has about, well, will this experiment in small r Republican or representative government, will this endure? And so this program of the abolition societies and their free black allies teaming up to emphasize Black citizenship and incorporation is a response to those arguments of slavery's defenders. But what it does is it makes Black citizenship and incorporation essential to first movement abolitionism. One more theme that's important to this program and vision of first movement abolitionism that I'll mention is the goal of overturning or defeating white prejudice. First movement abolitionists believed that white prejudice, ultimately racial prejudice, bolstered slavery and racial inequality in the United States. And these abolition societies, as well as free Black community leaders and pamphleteers, they sort of put forth a public campaign of persuasion, utilizing the press and print culture to target the white public, to try to overcome white prejudice and to prove to the larger white body politic that in fact there was an underlying equality of people of color, and that formerly enslaved people had an equal aptitude for freedom. And so they hoped that this then would really tear down what they saw as a really important pillar of slavery and racial inequality, and that was white prejudice and what would become increasingly referred to as racism. So those are three major themes and goals of first movement abolitionists and abolitionism. Now I want to talk about a bit more specifically about who made up this coalition of first movement abolitionists. Which historical actors are we talking about? There are four groups. One of them were Quakers, or the Society of Friends. They were really important. They were the first group of Americans in mass who really worked against slavery, and they, by the time of the Revolution, Quakers increasingly say that if you are part of that religious society, you cannot own enslaved people. And there's an anti-slavery movement that sort of grows up within the Society of Friends, within Quakers. And a lot of the strategies that I just mentioned that the first movement abolitionism implemented after the Revolution, Quakers really were a key part in that. They're key actors in the abolition societies, and their strategies really informed first movement abolitionism in a lot of ways. So Quakers are one group. Another group represented by sort of kind of revolutionary vanguard public figures, as you can see here, one of them, Benjamin Rush, who many of you probably have heard of, was a famous revolutionary era doctor and philosopher and American patriot. And he, along with other sort of Enlightenment-minded reform figures of prominence, were part of this coalition. So this included individuals, from those who weren't as involved, like Alexander Hamilton in the societies, but nonetheless did lend their support to the societies, to John Jay, the first Justice of the Supreme Court, to Daniel Tompkins, who was a governor of New York. These sort of Benjamin Franklin, who's the first president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. So really prominent figures who are part of this revolutionary political elite and sort of see abolitionism as an important reform movement that will kind of sweep away the barbaric social practices of monarchy and of pre-revolutionary times. So individuals like Benjamin Rush are certainly important. These revolutionary political elites are important figures in this coalition. Another group This slide here, I have feature 4 of these prominent individuals are Black community leaders in cities like New York and Philadelphia. So here, Richard Allen, the famed minister of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, Absalom Jones, also a minister in Philadelphia, Peter Williams Jr., a reverend. So you can see the theme here, that a lot of these leading figures were also leading religious figures within Black communities. James Forten of Philadelphia, who was a sailmaker and was one of the most economically and socially prominent free Black men of the post-revolutionary period. These men embodied the sort of hope and optimism of these Black communities as they're emerging out of the revolution and in the gradual emancipation period. And they really team up with the abolition societies to create this sort of goal of sort of fostering virtuous free Black communities by kind of melding both, really moral religious practices as well as meeting some of the other benchmarks of what were the model for being a virtuous citizen in the revolution, the post-revolutionary era and the early American Republic. So we're talking roughly here from like 1790 to 1820. So these sort of prominent free Black leaders were certainly in a very important part of this coalition. One more group that I'll point to were more historically marginalized people of color. So that group of people that I mentioned a little bit earlier in my talk, those individuals who were bringing these cases of illegal enslavement to these abolition societies, these people are really hard to, it's really hard to recapture their lives because we only have snippets into their lives from sources like this, which I have up here. And those are the internal sort of minutes or meeting recordings of the Abolition Society. So this is from the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, and they're referring here to a specific case of we only have a first name of this woman of color, Mary. And so these people's stories are hard to sort of fully recapture in the same way that you can recapture the lives of these more prominent African-American community leaders. But nonetheless, these more historically and economically marginalized people of color, men and women in cities like Philadelphia and New York, are nonetheless essential to this coalition because, again, they're teaming up with the abolition societies to enforce emancipation laws on the ground. So I have a chapter that's dedicated to sort of telling their stories and trying to recapture the partnership that they form with the abolition societies. Now, what did these very sort of disparate set of historical actors share? What they shared was this sort of optimism in anti-slavery, this idea that in fact, the kind of course of history and the trajectory of the new nation was heading in a direction that was going to oppose slavery. So they pointed to gradual emancipation laws. They pointed to the outlawing of the international slave trade in 1808. They pointed to the growing creation of free Black communities. They pointed to many factors to sort of say, this movement is part of this optimistic take on the belief that in fact, slavery and racial inequality are going to melt away over time through really hard activism. And so they were all sort of optimistic about meeting their goals. One more thing I want to mention about this movement before I talk about its sort of downfall and then briefly mention or lay out its legacies as I see it, is to address why I focus on the Mid-Atlantic region. So I don't focus in New England. I focus in the Mid-Atlantic region, especially New York and Pennsylvania. And this is because both, as I've been alluding to, the two most prominent abolition societies, the Pennsylvania Abolition Society and the New York Manumission Society, were located here. And also because in Philadelphia and New York City, you had two of the most politically and sort of activist, organized Black communities in the new nation. And look, there were other ones as well, like in Boston. So I'm not saying these are the only communities, but this is really a unique part of the country where you have this combination of these societies and these Black communities, and they're coming together to create this biracial movement called First Movement Abolitionism. Okay, now that I've laid out the movement, its goals, who was involved in the movement broadly, I want to talk about what happened to the movement. Ultimately, and I dedicate a chapter to this, but I'll just lay this out really broadly. What happens is that a new movement emerges called the colonization movement. So maybe you've heard of the American Colonization Society. It emerges in 1817. It's a very complex movement, a very complex organization, but basically, I focus on the elements of the colonization movement, which totally depart from first movement abolitionism. So the American Colonization Society and the colonization movement argues that, in fact, white prejudice can't be overcome. First movement abolitionism, as I've discussed, premised their entire activist agenda on the idea that, in fact, you could overturn white prejudice, that emancipated slaves could be made free, virtuous citizens of the Republic. But colonizationists, those who are genuinely opposed to slavery but are colonizationists, those who argue that to end slavery, you have to actually repatriate the freed outside of the bounds of the United States. That's someone who subscribes to colonization. They argue that white prejudice couldn't be overcome, and therefore they say, in fact, that permanent Black degradation would follow African-American freedom, as long as people of color, once they gained their freedom, remained in the United States. So it's a very different take on how to ultimately end slavery, right? Colonization is saying you have to end slavery by repatriating or basically colonizing those who are free. Total departure from first movement abolitionism, and historians have not emphasized enough how much this was a departure because they haven't unearthed and recovered first movement abolitionists in their agenda. So colonization takes hold, and by the 1820s in states like New York and Pennsylvania, it's really become successful among white activists. Part of the reason this is the case is that, as you can see from this racially denigrating cartoon from Philadelphia in the 1830s, the racial climate, if you will, of cities like Philadelphia and New York have just worsened for a host of reasons that I'm also happy to talk about in the Q&A, but just generally, white hostility to Black freedom for a variety of reasons had increased by the 1820s, certainly, and only more into the 1830s. And so increasingly, the optimism that first movement abolitionists had about slavery and ending it becomes less convincing among many abolitionists and anti-slavery activists, particularly white abolitionists and anti-slavery activists, because colonization is in fact going to divide in many ways white and Black activists. Colonization, in fact, as I've just alluded to, divides for the first movement abolition, the first abolition movement. So the abolition societies, which meet in a convention which includes all of their societies, debates for years colonization. Some first movement abolitionists who belong to these abolition societies say, look, I believe in Black capacity for freedom and Black virtuous citizenship, but white prejudice is just too strong, and we need to end slavery in Virginia and Maryland, and the only way to do that is to acknowledge that at least some people of color need to be repatriated outside of these states for emancipation to take hold there. Other first movement abolitionists say, no, I am committed to the first movement abolitionist formula of free Black incorporation and citizenship and overturning white prejudice. So the first movement abolition societies begin to really fight among each other about which course to take, whether to adopt and utilize colonization or not, or to ignore it. Now, Black communities within New York and especially Philadelphia are more resolute in opposing colonization. And in fact, Black community leaders and the larger Black communities within these cities really lead public opposition to colonization. And they do so in large part by, I argue, reasserting first movement abolitionist ideals and values, like the importance of Black incorporation, the importance in a belief that ultimately white prejudice could be overcome and that Black citizenship was essential to any anti-slavery reform agenda that would ultimately be worthy of support. One important vehicle for this sort of African-American opposition to colonization emerges with the first Black-owned and run newspaper called Freedom's Journal in New York, which is founded in 1827 and co-edited by this individual up here, Samuel Cornish. Samuel Cornish himself has a connection to the New York Manumission Society, so he is well versed in first movement abolitionist ideals. And this paper becomes sort of an important vehicle in giving full voice to opposition to colonization, especially a voice that utilizes and that draws on first movement abolitionist ideals to oppose colonization. Ultimately, the first movement abolitionist, or the first abolition movement or first movement abolitionism, one could say sort of it ends by 1837. That's the last year that this convention of first movement abolition societies comes together. Ultimately, what happens is that, again, as I mentioned, a lot of the members of the abolition society, the first movement abolition societies, had sort of divided about whether to embrace or reject colonization. So some of them end up becoming colonizationists, others of them end up becoming immediate abolitionists or antebellum abolitionists, those abolitionists we're more familiar with. But really, I argue that the ideals, the principles, and the agenda of first movement abolitionism doesn't actually end with the sort of death of the movement itself, if you will. So as I've been talking about, in one way, certainly the ideals of first movement abolitionism find form in the assertive and eloquent arguments of Black activists like Samuel Cornish, who are organizing and speaking directly out against colonization. And these individuals really helped to influence key immediate abolitionists of the 1830s, like William Lloyd Garrison. And so there's a direct connection between first movement abolitionism and some of the ideas that really emerge as central to immediate abolitionism of the 1830s. But really more broadly, and where I end the book, is with an argument that first movement abolitionist ideals of Black civil and civic rights and the defeat of white prejudice would inspire many later like-minded movements, from radical Reconstruction to civil rights activists, and to really, I think, overall largely in spirit and goals, to the Black Lives Matter movement. So there's a long-lasting and important legacy that first movement abolitionist carries forward long after the formal end of the movement itself. So I'm going to end there. I've talked enough, and I'd certainly love it if anyone had any questions or thoughts.
Great, thank you. That was really fascinating. I'm like really close to finishing up your book, so I'm like, I don't know, it's just really great. So I have a few questions, but I would just love to hear from our attendees as well. And I'm just wondering, so I know it's outside of the scope of your book, but I'm just curious. So kind of what do you think leads to the development of abolitionist movements in New England? You know, so you're saying that these earlier movements were in this mid-Atlantic region. And then obviously here on Nantucket, we do talk a lot about, you know, the abolitionist movement, but like you're saying, in the mid-19th century. So why do you think it took so long to get here?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I mean, part of what I'd say is that certainly first movement abolitionism I've been speaking about was so closely connected to Quakerism, and Quakers had really been really driven out of New England long before the American Revolution. So they weren't much of a presence there. I think also that a lot of, I guess I don't want to slight anti-slavery activism in Massachusetts, both among people of color themselves and among sort of Congregationalists. And, you know, Connecticut had a society Massachusetts certainly had individual important abolitionist activists, but it's really not until the Second Great Awakening that you see the sort of full flowering of a really concerted, organized abolition movement, which is more broad than sort of individual, more kind of petition campaigns by, Black communities and by individual white activists as well. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess, there's certainly a historical, a really rich historical literature on abolitionism in New England before the 1830s. So I don't want to slight that, but yeah, you just don't see that same combination of Quakerism, of these politically active and large-scale Black community partnerships, and these really influential revolutionary elites like Benjamin Rush all come together in New England to the same degree as you see in the Mid-Atlantic.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. So a couple of questions have come in. So one, can you just talk a little bit more about Quakerism's early influence on the first movement abolitionism? And I wonder if you could just give like a brief explanation of the Second Great Awakening, just in case, everyone's not familiar with that.
Yeah, no, and, so we can start with Quakers. I mean, they're so essential, and I certainly don't want to give them short shrift here. There's this way in which sometimes historians sort of deal with a lot of, I don't know, we'd call like insider baseball. And so, Quakerism and sort of anti-slavery in the period that I'm looking at is normally wholly associated with Quakerism. And so part of what I'm arguing is that it's much broader than that. But yes, Quakers are really essential. So, Quakers have this idea of this theology of the inner light, that within each individual, right, there is this sort of same essential nature and the light of God. Yet it takes a long time for Quakers to move against slavery. They're in fact prolific slave traders in cities like Philadelphia in a lot of the colonial era. But beginning especially in Pennsylvania in like the 1760s and after the 7 Years' War, there's this growth of this new generation of Quakers who move against slavery, and this spreads to other Quaker groups within the colonies turned states. And so they, as I sort of alluded to, really helped to trailblaze a lot of these strategies of so Anthony Benezet, who's a pretty well-known Quaker activist, helps lead Black educational sort of ventures and establishes schools, which help to influence schools for free Blacks that are created by the abolition societies. John Woolman, who's a really important activist, travels all across the Mid-Atlantic and attempts to persuade slaveholders to see the sin of slavery, and is sort of trying to create a larger public anti-slavery climate that is really important, I think, for informing first movement abolitionism. Quakers themselves are some of the most involved and hardest working members of these abolition societies that I've mentioned. So yeah, Quakers are absolutely essential as the sort of lifeblood of this movement. So I certainly don't want to give them short shrift, and I'm glad that question was asked. Now, the Second Great Awakening opens up a whole other can of worms here. It's really begins as early as the Revolution, but really takes hold of American society in the first 3 decades of the 19th century. And this idea of sort of converting the individual from sin and the idea of individual agency to see wrong and to take control of their own moral life and then to apply that to society, like that's very different from Puritanism, with the idea that people are innately sinful. And so this sort of more, I would say, optimistic belief in the capacity of individuals to be, moral, to partake in morally appropriate behavior and to change the world around them in moral ways, and to see that as a mission, that really helps to inform immediate abolitionism. And it is something that I think is a little different from first movement abolitionism, where religion's important, especially with Quakerism, but it is a little bit more secularly bound. Whereas the second movement of immediate abolitionism is so embedded within religious ideals of the Second Great Awakening. So there are connections, but the Second Great Awakening, which does so much to inform immediate abolitionism, is really more of a byproduct of a later period than my book is looking at.
And yet you really covered that so well. That was amazing. Thank you. So a couple of more questions. I'm just going to scoot down. So this one, you kind of touched on this a little bit, but can you just talk about when did the term racism and racist start being used?
Yeah, and that's a great question too. So race and the idea of races was around, before the revolution, right? But when people use that term, they were generally speaking more in terms of we would sort of call nationality or sort of ethnic identity. But this sort of like clear dichotomy bound in what we call race or racism between white and black, that's something that took a lot longer to develop. And that's why I'm very careful about my terminology, because the historical actors I look at, they use the term prejudice. And they saw hostility, sort of white hostility to black freedom, is something that could be changed, that was sort of a product of an unenlightened, non-independent American society that had yet to really, challenge kind of this unthinking acceptance of slavery. That slavery had been kind of like accepted uncritically, obviously not for many people who are enslaved, but on the broader societal level. And that if people, or if the white public could just be shown that in fact, enslaved people once freed could be just as virtuous in their freedom, and that their prejudice was just based on faulty assumptions, then that could be overturned. Now, racism becomes a much more sort of concretized term to mean a distinction between white and black people, increasingly as the 19th century moves forward. So I mentioned how sort of the racial climate for black people and sort of race relations becomes increasingly polarized and difficult in the 1820s. That only grows into the 1830s and 40s. And, look, racism as a pseudoscience really actually explodes after the Civil War and after Reconstruction into the late 19th century and early 20th century. So I think the way that we think of racism as this kind of pseudoscience of this kind of inimical ideology that people are kind of innately different, that's already there. The ideas are there, but there isn't this sort of large-scale ideology and kind of pseudoscience that comes to inform racism as we know it until much later in American history. And I think, again, that's really important for my book because, again, to my historical actors between the 1790s and the 1820s, they see what we call racism as prejudice, and they see it as much more capable of being sort of overturned and conquered.
Excellent, thank you. So we've had a couple of people ask a somewhat similar question, and so that is, what kind of efforts were there similar efforts for Indigenous peoples at the same time, and just what kind of overlap or not overlap was there?
Yeah, so that's certainly a story that I don't deal as much with, but is certainly an important one. Attempts at sort of creating native communities that will kind of meet the benchmarks for what Europeans consider civilization, stretches all the way back to 17th century Massachusetts, and is probably most well known in sort of regards or in connection to what we call Indian removal in the 1830s, where you have these native communities that have adopted sort of American sort of agriculture and religion and society, and yet nonetheless are removed from their ancestral lands in what was then the Southwest. And so, yeah, I mean, there are connections in that there are, it's really interesting. Like there are actual colonizationists who believe on the one hand that white and black people can't live together, but then on the other hand are really strongly against Indian removal. And on the other hand, there are those that are strongly or are in favor of Indian removal, or who don't sort of feel as strongly against it, who are, part of an anti-slavery coalition. So these two things don't necessarily always match up, but they are sort of intertwined at different points. But like, was there the equivalent of this kind of movement that joined Native peoples with sort of white Americans and created these societies? No. And I think a big part of that is because there wasn't the equivalent of this central socio-political economic institution of slavery that really made the abolition movement really central in ways that Native history and certainly and this push against Native exclusion and for Native American rights is definitely important to American history, but there wasn't that same equivalent institution of slavery to sort of give it broader currency like what you see with abolition movements.
Great, thank you. So we've had someone ask, can you just clarify why was it called immediate abolitionism?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And thanks again I'm happy to do any of these or answer any of these definitional questions, and that's an important one. Yeah, so, okay, immediate abolitionists or abolitionism is connected with this idea that slavery as an institution needs to be immediately confronted and needs to immediately be put on the road to extinction. And I'm making that distinction because, in fact, people often think of immediate abolitionism as this argument that slavery had to be ended literally overnight. And that's actually not what immediate abolitionists are saying. They're drawing on that Second Great Awakening idea that you have to confront sin immediately, and you can't put it off. You can't just sort of say, we'll deal with slavery later. They're trying by the 1830s to make slavery a central political issue and an issue that Americans have to confront morally. Because what's happened is that between 1790 and 1830, slavery has expanded and grown. It has more political power than ever, and it is more of a presence in the American Republic than it had been in the 1790s. And so immediate abolitionists, that terminology is really, it's more than just sort of saying slavery should end immediately. It's really saying the nation needs to confront slavery as a moral problem immediately. And they're saying colonizationists aren't, confronting slavery as a moral problem at all. So that's sort of this sense of immediate abolitionism. Now, it's often called immediate abolitionism in comparison to gradual abolitionism, which is often associated with the historical actors I've talked about, who again were advocating or who were part of this larger era where slavery is going to be put on the road to gradual extinction. So I don't want to say there's no distinction between gradual abolitionism and immediate abolitionism, but I think sometimes that line is sort of drawn too starkly.
Yeah, thank you. So going to a very granular level from the big picture, so we have a direct descendant of William Still here with us tonight, and he's just wondering how much of his contributions, were addressed in your book.
Yeah, Still is an absolutely fascinating and important figure. Unfortunately, for my book, his activism really emerges after I kind of leave off. So what I do in the book is I sort of turn to colonization and its emergence to sort of tell the larger history of why I believe first movement abolitionism has been slighted in the historical memory. So William Still is such a fascinating, important figure. And in fact, I know someone writing a biography on him. He's a key figure in the Underground Railroad in Philadelphia. He's a really important Black political figure. But yeah, his activism is really centered in a time period that goes beyond my focus.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you. So the next question we've had come in. So can you just, I feel like I'm more familiar with this as, in the 1830s and onward, where there's an opposition to, in New England, to financing slavery from financial institutions, and this belief of compensating, or, opposition against compensating slave owners upon the freedom of their enslaved people. And so were either of those things really, what were the takes on them for the first movement?
Yeah, so the idea of like compensation for
Just that, that, you have all these people who are your property, they're making money for you, now you've lost them, so we should compensate them. So is that something that appeared?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I mean, I guess the answer is almost hiding in plain sight, right? Because it's kind of implicit in gradual emancipation, right? So gradual emancipation in these laws say that after this given date, for example, in Pennsylvania, it's after January 1, 1780, all those people who are born to enslaved mothers, because slavery is passed down through the matrilineal line, they will gain their freedom after the ages of 28. Now, it says nothing about those who, if you're born a day before the law passes, that law, according to that law, you're enslaved for life. If you're born the day after it passes, you will serve as an indentured servant with rights that enslaved people don't have, but still not completely free until the age of 28. So within that formula is an implicit but important recognition of slaveholders to property rights and people, right? So, I mean, it's a compromise it's a form of compensated emancipation right there. Now, beyond this, there was a debate after 1780, because there's all of this attempts by the abolition societies and African Americans themselves to utilize other laws that were connected to that gradual emancipation statute to gain more immediate freedom for enslaved people. And so there's this debate about whether to create a law that will compensate slaveholders more directly to gain quicker freedom for more people of color. And so there is, and that doesn't end up being adopted, and there's disagreement about activists about whether if you do that, you're almost implying that that slaveholders have total rights to property and people. So there's this debate. But yeah, I mean, I guess the short answer is just that property rights and people and compensation is kind of embedded in gradual emancipation itself.
Yeah, that makes sense. So kind of going back to your research process, could you talk about, like, what would you say most surprised you during the process of doing your research?
Yeah, no, that's a great question too. I mean, I guess to me, like, I don't know, every historian who does a project survey has to have like an aha moment, right? And so for me, like, I tried to communicate that with that seal, right? So that image I showed, which is also sort of part of the book cover for my book, I have been sort of teasing out these different themes that I talked about, as a grad student about the first abolition movement. But that, to me, that illustration just captured in one image all of these ideals that I had been, sort of teasing out from the historical record. So that's one thing. The other thing would be, I think, and I also showed an image of this, going through the minutes of those records of both the Pennsylvania Abolition Society and the New York Manumission Society, and just getting this window into the lives of these individuals that are otherwise lost to the historical record. I mean, it's just like you'll just hold your breath as you're going through the microfilm, and this case will emerge, and you're going to, okay, what's going to happen? Is it going to be resolved? Is this illegally enslaved person going to gain their freedom or not? And they'll come and they'll testify before, or give information before the societies, and you get this like brief window into the lives of these people that are otherwise lost to the historical record. And so that was really exhilarating. It turns exciting and depressing depending on how these cases turned out. But I'd say that was another sort of really important moment for me in the archive.
Oh, that was amazing. Thank you. So another question is, so could you just, I guess, something that I've been thinking about is that I don't really have a good sense over time of like how cities have grown. That's like something I've been learning more about. And so can you just talk a little bit about like how widespread were these organizations at the time? Like, I mean, obviously Philadelphia and New York, they would have been so much smaller than they are today. And so were these well-known groups? How big was their membership? Can you just give us a sense of scale?
Yeah, so they were really well connected both nationally and internationally. So they had, for example, especially the Pennsylvania Abolition Society had connections with networks, whether it be other societies or just other individuals from states ranging as far south, believe it or not, as Mississippi, where I am, which is not wasn't exactly a hotbed of abolitionism in the 19th century, to Boston, but then also across the Atlantic Ocean into the West Indies. And so like it's really remarkable. I mean, we think of social media and how, we get all this communication, and back in the 18th century, the 19th century, how did people do it? But, it took longer to communicate because you were writing, they didn't even have the telegraph then, or writing through letters, but there's extensive communication networks that really linked these societies domestically and abroad. Now, in terms of membership, yeah, I mean, that's an important question. And so on the one hand, there are actually technically, I think there are over 1,000 members over a 40-year period to the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. However, it's very misleading because if you were nominated and made a member, that didn't mean that you were actively involved in the society. So when you actually hone in these societies like the New York Manumission Society, the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, and for smaller societies in states ranging from Virginia to Connecticut, sometimes even smaller, you're getting 15 people at meetings, and then some of the sort of grunt work, it could be even 6 or 7 people. So we are talking, active membership at a given time could be, 24 to 100. It's not a mass movement. It isn't. And I don't claim it as a mass movement. That is something that differentiates it from the immediate abolition movement, the antebellum abolition movement of the 1830s to the Civil War. So it's, sort of the larger membership was pretty broad, but again, active involvement in these societies was relatively small if you're talking about just the societies itself. If you're talking about the broader links, I argue, these societies had with, Black Americans in these communities, it's broader, but, that's outside of the official membership of the societies themselves.
Great, thank you. So we have just about 5 more minutes. So if there are any final questions, please feel free to send them in. So one more question that we have here is, so you've talked about racism. So what is your take on caste?
Yeah, that's another one. There's so many things obviously I could have included in my presentation. I guess I don't want to give too glossy a look here of First Movement abolitionism, and the book is, it's very nuanced. It's a deeply revised dissertation. I had the years to make it extremely as nuanced as I possibly could, and I evolved the argument. And I guess what immediately comes to mind when I think of caste, the way I depict that is class, right? And so, yeah, there were class dimensions to this movement. Okay, what I mean by that is that the societies and certain Black leaders as well, like Richard Allen and Absalom Jones and Peter Williams Jr., they had sort of what we'd call a paternalistic approach to anti-slavery. So they had these ideas about what made virtuous citizenship possible and the sort of behavior that larger free Black communities should take on. And they sort of said, you need to live up to these ideas. Now, these ideals, of course, are class-based, right? They are implicitly putting forth a certain agenda and program for how to define, for example, virtuous citizenship, what makes for a responsible and good citizen of the Republic. So this movement is definitely infused with what we call paternalism, or sort of class-based expectations about what Black freedom should look like. And important to acknowledge, it's not racist, and I think that historians unfortunately have conflated paternalism with racism when it comes to abolitionism here. Paternalism as an ideology in the slaveholding South is certainly racist, but paternalism within this abolition movement, even though it's class-based, it's elitist at times, it nonetheless is arguing that in fact, these ideals of citizenship should not be defined along lines of race. That in fact, a white free person and a black free person are equally capable of living up to these ideals of citizenship. And yet again, class is absolutely a really important factor here.
Awesome. Well, not awesome, but thank you. And that is actually our last question. So I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk so extensively on all of these topics tonight. And to thank you guys for attending. And I just want to say, so I do have the book here in my interlibrary loan copy. So I would just say, if you really enjoyed tonight's talk, if you enjoyed Barbara White's Disturber tradition, this is definitely a really great read. So please be sure to check it out. And thanks for spending a part of your evening with us tonight. Please join us on December 15th. So we're going to hear from Cabria Baumgartner on the Black women in the integration of Massachusetts schools, including here on Nantucket. And I just want to say that programs such as this one are made possible thanks to the support of our members. So if you're not a member, please consider joining by heading to nha.org/membership. And just thank you so much for joining us, and have a great night.